Good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to the AtlanTec Festival 2022. We're delighted to be back again. This is our 8th year, and this year we've got a hybrid event, so we're delighted to have you all back with us. We've got a hybrid event both online and in person across 5 days. We've got 35 different events and 40 plus speakers, and we're delighted to welcome you all here this morning. As this is our opening event, I'd like to invite Ed Gillespie I'd like to invite David Birmingham, who is the chair of the ITAG committee, to actually kick off and open the festival for us. David, could you join us on stage?
You can hear me, Seamus, can you? Seamus?
We can hear you perfectly, David. Good morning. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Very good. Good morning to you. This is an interesting first time in this platform, so trying to find my way around, but it's really impressive and really delighted to see so many people join us for the opening session this morning at 10 o'clock. So thanks for the quick introduction there, Seamus. I won't keep people. I know people are very keen to hear Keith. I certainly am. But just to welcome everybody formally, I mean, as you mentioned, the 8th year, an amazing lineup this year with 50 speakers, 40 events. This year, the focus is on the art of digitalization and acceleration. And I think it's a very apt topic based on, digital transformation is nothing new. We're all well aware of it. It's been around for a long time. But I think the disruption of the pandemic certainly has made has been a progress test for every organization. And I saw an interesting stat there last week or so, which showed that between 2019 and 2020, that business channels, this was from McKinsey, replaced business channels with digital, jumped from 16% in 2019 to 34% in 2020, which is effectively related to about 10 years of digitalization in under 1 year. So we're really seeing this, acceleration at an absolute unprecedented pace. But also, I think it's resulting in a tremendous pent-up demand for speed and automation and integration. So I think we're absolutely, on the right money here in terms of the content and the topics that are going to be covered this week. We have lots of really interesting sessions lined up, so I hope everybody enjoys it. I just would quite like to just briefly mention a quick thank you to all the sponsors, without whom we wouldn't be able to run this event. There's far too many to go through one by one, but I know that we really do appreciate your support and help to make this conference happen. So thank you to all our key sponsors. I hope everybody has a great week. I'm looking forward to meeting some people in person later in the week at some of the other in-person events. But back to you, Seamus, to kick things off. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, David, and that's great. So, as I said, we're online and we're in person this week. We'd love for you to follow us on Twitter. We're at AtlanTec Fest, and you can use the hashtag @AtlanTec. That's why this topic today is of interest to you, and we're all here to see what's of interest within our tech community of innovators and practitioners along Ireland's western seaboard, what we call the Atlantic Gateway. These events are supported by the tech community to enable the sharing of expertise and knowledge. As you know, my name is Seamus Hayes. I'm from Genesis, and I'm delighted to be your event moderator today. So this is the first in a week long of calendar events. For some, it started last Friday night at the ITAG Awards in Galway's Hardyman Hotel. And it was great to be back at an in-person event and to meet so many familiar faces for the first time in a number of years after the whole COVID pandemic. As I said, this year's AtlanTec Festival is a hybrid event. We have a number of virtual event speakers from all across the Atlantic region on our western seaboard in Galway. Our speaker this morning is in the UK, Ed is in the UK, and we've got speakers from across the UK and the US as well. This Wednesday morning we gather in for an in-person event in NUI Galway, where we'll be discussing the future of software development, and a number of individual speakers and a panel discussion going on that morning. And finally, this Friday, we wrap the festival up with the ITAG Tag Rugby event as well, Friday afternoon. For more details on all of the events that are on this week, and indeed to register, visit www.atlantec.ie. So as David mentioned, it goes without saying that events like this are not possible without the support of our sponsors. And so on behalf of the AtlanTec Committee, I would like to sincerely thank all of this year's sponsors for their continued support in everything that we do across the Atlantic Gateway. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ed Gillespie, who is going to explore the carbon impact of the exponential growth of the online world, from energy use in data centers to the footprint of cryptocurrency mining, and to look at what a truly creative and non-linear response from the tech world might look like and how we might make that happen. So for those of you, I'm a marine biologist who is now a director of Greenpeace UK, and he works on responsible leadership with the Forward Institute. He's a serial green entrepreneur and practices what he rightly calls insultancy. But that's being strategically rude to his clients to raise their sustainability ambitions. Ed is an author, he's a communications expert and a multiple entrepreneur, an analyst of future trends. He specializes in helping audiences understand the complex changes facing the world, from climate change to disruptive innovation, and provides them with actionable insights for their organization. His book, Only Planet, A Flight Free Adventure Around the World, records his circumnavigation of the globe without getting on a plane. And The Independent said that this book allows the world's flaws and beauty to seep into your soul. So with that, Ed, I'm going to pass the floor over to you, and looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Seamus, for that glowing introduction. It's a very great pleasure to be joining you all. I wish I was joining you physically on the west coast of Ireland. Actually, the last live gig I did pre-pandemic was in Limerick. So this is a nice bit of circularity. I'm just trying to share my screen here. Like Mr. Birmingham, I'm unfamiliar with this platform, and it doesn't seem to be being too amenable to me.
How's it going, Ed?
Jay, well, window, it's not showing all of my documents, so I don't quite know why that is.
So you've clicked on share on the bottom and share screen.
Yeah, hang on, let me just, I think it might be because I was on full screen, so that's why. And maybe if I come, that's fixed it. Perfect. Okay, so it's always good to start a technology conference with a technology glitch. But so I am going to be talking to you for the next half hour or so about technology as a climate question. Now, I mean that is in a very big sense of being an enormous question. And I'm going to try and zero in on the nexus between digitalization and acceleration, that is the theme of your event, through the lens of energy, carbon, and climate. And it would be remiss of me to start any talk like this without acknowledging what is happening in Ukraine right now, because let's be incredibly clear that this is an integral part of some of the interconnected challenges that we face, and that there are all sorts of issues around energy and food, and obviously the threat to peace and security that have arisen over the last couple of months. Because in many senses, actually, this can feel like the apocalypse. We've lived through a pretty unprecedented 3 years. And I mean that not in the apocalyptic end of the world sense, but actually in the true etymology of the word, which is the uncovering, the revelation, the drawing back of the veil to see the world as it actually works. Because when you do that, and some of that pipe work is exposed, we often find ourselves seeing how inadequate many of the systems we have in place are for dealing with the bumps that are coming down the road. And my job as a futurist is not to predict and analyze existing trends and to see where they might be going, but to actually actively stretch the imagination of the possible, to try and get us to do what needs to be done. And in order to do that well, you have to listen. And you have to listen to the real questions that the future is asking you, and indeed asking of you. And I speak at a lot of different events. Most recently, perhaps this one, which was a lawnmower service magazine. I get all the glamorous gigs. But if they are listening to the questions that the future is asking of them, this is a 125-mile-an-hour lawnmower, I'm pretty sure that the future is not saying, where is my 125-mile-an-hour lawnmower? That is perhaps technology as a rather wrong-headed climate question. And the theme I'm going to use to explore this is based around a podcast I do with my fellow reluctant futurist Mark Stevenson and comedian John Richardson, called John Richardson and the Futurenauts. And in that podcast, where we tackle lots of future-focused issues, a different subject each week, we ask 3 questions. How effed are we? Why are we effed? And how do we un-eff ourselves? And I'm broadly going to stick to that approach for the rest of this talk. So, firstly, how effed are we when it comes to climate technology and the digital world? Well, I've been working in climate change for 25 years now, half of my adult life, and it's quite clear that the situation has evolved very rapidly from a sort of denial to, oh, it's there and we're not actually denying it, but we're not convinced it's caused by us, to a sort of moment of rather belated realization that we might be in trouble. And I put it to you that we're facing 3 key comfortable myths, or we're telling ourselves 3 key comfortable myths. One, that we feel like we know what's going on and what's likely to happen in the coming decade or so. Secondly, that we're in control and that whatever happens, we can tame the situation. And thirdly, we understand the leadership that's required and that our decision-making institutions are up to it. And clearly, we've had a baptism of fire over the last 24 to 30 months in terms of testing some of those myths. Because about 2 years ago, I gave a talk just pre-pandemic at the Bank of England on what we might call low probability but high impact risks. Those things which are quite unlikely to happen, but when they do, are extremely disruptive. And this was off the back of the Australian fires. And we were talking in that workshop about extreme climate change, pandemics, as I said, pre-pandemic, economic crises, and then we've had all 3, and with war thrown into the mix as well. And the reason I mention that is because we've become very familiar with some of the interventions that have come about as a result of COVID, where we're trying to bring in the protective measures in extreme cases like lockdowns, which draw down the number of COVID cases within the carrying capacity of the healthcare system. But equally, you could apply a similar type of logic to the climate change challenge, where we need to bring in these climate protective measures to reduce global temperature change below 2 degrees and ideally on the 1.5 degree threshold that the Paris Agreement outlines. Because as Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, rightly points out, we can't self-isolate from climate change in the same way that we can't self-isolate entirely effectively from the pandemic. And if you haven't read the 3,000 pages of the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, then allow me to summarize briefly for you. It's us. We are to blame. That's pretty much unequivocal. The changes we've set in place are unprecedented. And indeed, some of those are now inevitable and irreversible. So what actually happens as a result of this? Well, temperatures are only going one way. They're only going to get hotter. We've added about 1.1 degree of global climate change since the Industrial Revolution in 1850. 1.5 degrees is pretty much baked in, pun intended, in all scenarios. And the past 7 years have been the hottest on record. So the trajectory is quite clear. And as a result of that, if you imagine what we're doing is essentially putting more heat into a system to make it more turbulent, which is why we're getting all of these different extremes, from heat waves to more intense tropical cyclones, to precipitation events, to droughts, and these longer fire seasons. And perhaps in this corner of northwestern Europe, we'll remember the 3 storms that came in swift succession a month or so ago, Dudley, Eunice, and Franklin. And the impacts of that are obviously also financial, because what we're seeing is these huge, slightly catastrophic events, whether they're floods, storms, or wildfires. And many in the insurance industry, this is some data from Swiss Re, talking about the increasing intensity and frequency of these events, are describing the future as a potentially uninsurable world. So a lot of that is getting aggressively difficult to deal with. And at the same time, we are way off where we need to be in terms of delivering carbon cuts. If you look at the blue band on this graph, that's where our current policies and actions are taking us, somewhere between 2.5 and almost 3 degrees. And the green band is where we need to be, which is the 1.5 degree consistent trajectory. And you can see right now, by the end of the decade, we have this ambition gap of around about 20 gigatons of carbon that we have to get out of the system very, very quickly indeed. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, perhaps put this best when he said, delay is death in terms of the inaction that we've seen to date. So let's be really explicit about this. This is every sector in every context having to dramatically and rapidly cut its carbon footprint without exception. Because right now what we're dealing with is climate change as a threat multiplier, and arguably the greatest risk management failure in history. And if you look at the European Council for Internal Auditors, they are now describing climate change as a principal and forever risk at the heart of every organization, and one that is not going away. Now, we compound that with the situation that you guys are in, as we were describing at the beginning. This is the era of digitalization and acceleration. It is the era of big data, and there is exponential growth going on. We know, and I've been observing this through my work for the last few years, this huge growth in terms of the number of internet users. We've got almost 2/3 of the world now online, almost 5 billion people. And that growth is only set to continue. So we've seen this sort of relentless march of more and more people joining the digital world, with obviously around about 5 billion now, but potentially with the whole world practically online by the end of this decade. Now, there's enormous power in that, which is why we have been going through this phase, as we said right at the start, of having a decade's worth of digital acceleration in a little over 12 months. But Bob Metcalfe, who's one of obviously the founders and developers of the Ethernet, once described his law as the value of a telecommunications network is proportional to the square of the number of connected users of the system. So there's clearly enormous value coming through as we get this better connected and integrated world. And in some senses, that image on the left, which is a sort of map, a figurative map of the internet, is not dissimilar to the connections that we see that exist within the human brain. Now, unfortunately, what we're looking at the moment is perhaps not that wonderful, interconnected, happy place of digitalized experience. We're seeing something which is a little bit more turbulent and fragmented. But the result of having almost 5 billion people online every day is obviously a gargantuan amount of data exchange and data aggregation. And every minute of every day, it doesn't matter whether we're looking at TikTok with about 167 million videos watched every minute, or 5.7 million Google searches done. You can see whatever of these platforms you look at, there is a huge amount of activity happening on. And we're reaching now the point of about 2.5 quintillion bytes of data a day. That's 10 to the power 18 for those of you mathematically inclined. 2.5 quintillion bytes of data a day. Now, for those of us who are old enough to remember the Sinclair ZX81, that first home computer with a working memory of 1K, it's quite clear exactly how we'd sort of dwarfed the progress over the last 40 years or so. And indeed, the language we're having to use now is starting to get into somewhat science fiction type territory, where we're moving from zillions to bazillions to quintillions to gajillions. But what is happening now is almost a kind of exponential type of doubling. So we've seen data growth from over the last sort of decade or so. You can see creeping up on the graph here, but we're actually forecast to see another doubling over the next 2 or 3 years. And that's from 97 zettabytes to 181 zettabytes. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the zettabyte, this is now the zettabyte era. This is 1 to the power of 10 to the power of 21, rather. So that's about sextillion bytes, or about 1 zettabyte being approximately equal to 1 trillion gigabytes. So this is quite big stuff to try and get our little human brains around in terms of the scale of this data aggregation. And of course, Added to that is the Internet of Things, where we're having an increasing array of connected devices being linked in online and aggregating all sorts of data there as well. And again, over the last decade or so, they've gone from around 8 billion devices in 2020 and we're predicted to grow to about 25 billion. So a tripling of the number of things connected online as we move forward. Now, there may not be everything you want to have sharing data with the rest of the world. I came across this charming rectal thermometer, which, you know, if you want to share the temperature of your bum with the rest of the planet, that is entirely up to you. But perhaps there are some things which genuinely and authentically don't need a smart upgrade right at this point in time. But the point I'm trying to make is we are essentially facing a tsunami of data. You know, most of the world's data has been collected and collated in the last 2 or 3 years, depending on which sources you look at. Somewhere between 75 and 90% of the world's data has been aggregated and collected in the last 2 or 3 years alone. Now, that's huge, and it has implications, as we've rapidly learnt through the cryptocurrency world and the energy consumption from Bitcoin mining, with the electricity consumption of Bitcoin mining alone being now larger than a modest nation state, whether it's the Netherlands or New Zealand. So this stuff is not without impact, and Bitcoin's recent tanking aside, these are huge impacts. And I've got to get to why that's so relevant in a moment. So circling back to those 3 key comfortable myths that I think we've been telling ourselves, I put it to you that actually we face 3 key uncomfortable truths. One, that there are a whole bunch of unknown unknowns climatically happening, that we're not in control of this system, either in terms of global temperature and atmosphere, or indeed in the way that we're collecting data. And thirdly, that leadership is just part of the mix of responsible organizing, that actually solutions are most likely to happen both top down and bottom up. They have to come from industry leaders, but they also have to come from the grassroots. So hopefully that gives you a reasonable insight into how effed we are. So it's worth just spending a moment pausing on, so why are we so effed? Well, how have we got into this mess? Because we won't be able to come to solutions until we work out and understand how we got here. Well, partly this is because climate change is not like the ozone layer. You know, it's not one thing in one place. It's complex. It's not like a war because it's caused by us and our lifestyles, and we're all on multiple sides at the same time. Equally, it's not really like an asteroid because it's not an intergalactic accident. It has a deep history and vested interests involved. So in that sense, it's not a problem that is easily fixed. It's more like an era or a predicament where it's here now, it's us, and it's clear, and we have to act. Now, many of you might have seen the Netflix movie Don't Look Up. We are still resistant to looking up and into this problem in a really genuinely open-eyed fashion, because part of the issue has been the great acceleration, where a lot of these different trends, whether it's world population or primary energy use, or some of these Earth system trends, such as carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, you can see that most of them go exponential around about 1950. Now, that's partly as a result of population growth from around about 1.5 billion at the turn of the 20th century to around 7.5 billion today. But it's not just that, as we'll see. But the implications of that great acceleration are, as the Stockholm Resilience Centre's Professor Johan Rockstrom has said, the planet starting to send back invoices to the economy. It's basically asking us to pay back effectively some of the ecological debt we have created and some of the impacts on the essential ecosystem services that we are now making. And the internet and the digital world is obviously not alone on this. If you add together direct energy consumption plus the production and movement of those gadgets, then we get about 3.7% of global carbon is coming from that world. So that's bigger than aviation at the moment. So it's a significant chunk and obviously only set to grow. Now, the internet uses a huge amount of energy because of these different factors. As I said, it's about the manufacturing and shipping of all of the different components, but also about the energy use and the cooling and the data centers and those things. And as Jeremy Govan, the author of Worldwide Waste, points out, it's like digital is not virtual, it's physical. And in that sense, digital is not green because it is always physical somewhere. That supposed clean, high-tech, futuristic, techno-utopian world always has a grounding and an impact somewhere. And in that sense, digital is still contributing to costing the earth. And in one sense, we are absolutely profligate because we are essentially tolerating 90% waste. Around 90% of the data that we store is never accessed. And never again, 3 months after it is first acquired. Businesses are actually only using and analyzing around 10% of the data they collect. And 90% of all sensor data collected for the Internet of Things is also never used. So, which begs the question, what other sector would we tolerate that level of wastage in? If we were to have a similar kind of 90% waste in our recycling system, I think people would be outraged. So we're not using this stuff very effectively, and we're being quite wasteful and profligate. And that's before we start to get into the huge energy demands of the metaverse that Mark Zuckerberg is and Meta are hopefully, threatening to bring to us, which, you know, if it's going to be just an extension in this, as this wonderful Private Eye cartoon points out, of the current digital realm of endless possibilities, where it's another excuse for conspiracy theories to flourish, for all sorts of dubious sexual behaviors to be practiced, or in fact, for just to sell us more stuff again. Because coming back to those great acceleration trends, it's not actually about population growth. It's actually about consumption when we come to the percentage of carbon emissions by number of people, because it is the richest 10% of the world that are responsible for almost half of those total lifestyle consumption emissions. So it's us. It's basically us in the developed north, and the consumption machine is being driven by a lot of our online world. As they say in Fight Club, we buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like, who largely don't care. And one thing that we really do need to regalvanize is this idea of people as citizens, not consumers. As my friend John Alexander points out in his brilliant new book, we need to become genuine digital citizens, not just digital consumers. Because the other mega trend that's going on is this vast acceleration and growth in renewable energy. So, you know, how renewable energy has become unstoppable. This is the Financial Times, not some left-wing anarchist student rag pointing this out. But the growth in renewable energy has been incredibly quick. And yet at the same time, our wholesale natural gas prices are the most expensive they have ever been. And obviously that's been aggravated by the crisis in Ukraine. But equally, that trend has been going up for some time. And there's a reason for that. Clearly, as I said at the beginning, the Ukraine situation cannot be ignored in this sense, because if you look at Russian exports, around about 70% of the value of those Russian exports comes from oil and gas. And so dependence on fossil fuels is essentially driving and funding that conflict. The Russian economy making about $3.5 trillion, according to Transparency International, over the last 7 or 8 years from those resources alone. And also, because our global energy demand has continued to increase, whilst we have been growing renewables at twice the rate or 3 times the rate of fossil fuels at around 5% a year against 1.7% a year, we haven't really shifted any of that global energy mix. So from 2009 to 2019, we only moved from 80.3% fossil fuels in the global energy mix to 80.2%. As my colleague at Greenpeace, John Sovan, dryly noted, we're going to have to speed that one up a bit, because what is happening is all our heroic renewable energy efforts are additional. They're not displacing fossil fuels. It's not enough to just do the good things. We have to stop doing the bad things. So right now, we're still burning more fossil fuels than ever before. So anything that is using energy that is coming from fossil fuels is driving conflict and the climate crisis. So the position we find ourselves in is quite blunt. Do we pursue this path towards breakdown? Are we aligned with change as usual, which is the same kind of incremental efficiencies, or can we find a breakthrough moment that will genuinely take us into a brave new world? And in order to get there, we have to overcome some of the willful blindness. Willful blindness is actually a legal principle that you're responsible if you could have known or should have known something which instead you strove, or worse, actively chose not to see. And that's why I talk a lot about being open-eyed about the reality of the situation and not relying on lazy assumptions. Because in many respects, that pandemic experience over the last 2 years has been like a mirror, a dark mirror held up to humanity. Excuse me. So in that mirror, do we either see Narcissus, a moment of self-love and self-congratulation about how well or we think we've navigated this, or is it a moment of catharsis where we can actually look into that apocalyptic vision, the revelation and the drawing back of the veil, and actually find the capacity for radical change? So I want to finish up on some upbeat notes about how do we un-F ourselves. We've seen that we're quite effed. We understand a bit more about why we are there. How do we un-F ourselves? Well, as I said, overcoming that willful blindness means tackling the honesty gap about the ease of the transition. This is not going to be comfortable. A lot of our politicians in particular want to sort of argue that the climate transition is going to be pain-free, and I don't think that's the case. And that requires us to shift culturally a little in terms of our expectations, because all of our great strategic planning will be undermined unless we have a culture which will support the activation of what needs to be done and doesn't fight against it. And inequality, which exists just as much in the digital world as it does in the real world, is key to this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has actually said that the best and most effective and lasting protection from climate chaos comes through action that addresses inequities and inequalities, wherever they are based, whether it's gender, ethnic, disability, age, location, income, or, as I said, the great digital divide that many of us have been discussing and talking about for a very long time. And that also requires us to break some of the code of silence that exists, where the mafia type omerta is there, where we don't want to talk about those difficult things. The willful blindness applies here. This is like, how do we have those awkward and uncomfortable conversations about where the real impacts actually lie? Because we're on this race to net zero. Actually, we have global agreement through the Paris Agreement and then the Glasgow Climate Pact. So the destination is now agreed. It's only how fast we get there that is really up for debate. And that's why I talk about culture wars, because we now have a situation where net zero is becoming an element of the culture war, where people are now starting to ask, can we afford to go net zero? Do we have the resources? Is this the right timing and prioritization for something which those of us in the scientific world know is absolutely non-negotiable, essential, and indeed existential? And there's some point of optimism in a way, because whilst, and this is data from the International Energy Agency, so whilst the global trends in internet traffic and data center workloads and energy use have gone up, actually data center energy use has managed to be relatively stable, even as we have collected and collated and exchanged and stored more data. And that's because we've been able to deliver radical efficiencies and new renewable energy sources as we've been moving forward. Now, the question is, can that be sustained as data and the digital world genuinely goes truly exponential? We've seen many of the big players step in terms of, Apple going 100% renewables, Microsoft aiming to absorb its historical emissions, all its historical emissions by 2050, Facebook going green as well in terms of 100% renewable energy. So lots of positive steps in that regard. And we also know that whatever area we look at, there will be technological interventions which will help us to reach that halving of carbon footprint, which is what we have to do by 2030. In the next 8 short years, we basically have to halve that carbon footprint. And I just want to zero in briefly on energy to illustrate how that might be done. Now, I've been, as I said, involved in this for a very long time. I worked as a marine biologist in Orkney in the late 90s. And here, this is one of the UK's first onshore wind turbines at Burgess Hill in Orkney. As you can see, it's been subsequently been knocked down, but this was a pioneering prototype, concrete tower, 2 blades. You could hear this thing about 5 miles away when it got going. And we've come a very long way since then. You know, the next generation of offshore wind turbines will be 15 to 17 megawatts and the size of the Shard in London. So true giants. And in actual fact, that renewable energy growth will continue, with the IEA actually saying that wind power could meet the world's entire electricity needs 18 times over with the right levels of support. But perhaps from the digital and technology perspective is the role of data in the cliche as the new oil, because that is where perhaps the real wealth lies. Google DeepMind have been working intensively on trying to use machine learning to predict the power output from wind energy to try and overcome some of the variability and supposed inconsistency of renewable energy technologies. And so coming up with some really good predictions of the likely energy to be generated from these systems, which also means with greater predictability, we can increase the value of those joules that are sold into the grid. So some really powerful, interesting stuff happening there. And perhaps more interestingly is the open climate fix approach, a not-for-profit started up by a guy from Google DeepMind called Jack Kelly. And they're doing a similar thing with photovoltaics. So mapping all of the photovoltaic units, being able to match those with weather data and meteorological data of cloud cover, and therefore predict the likely energy to be generated by the national photovoltaic arrays. Really interesting, because when you have that greater predictability of things like wind and solar, then you can turn down your fossil fuel reserve. You can turn down those turbines, those big gas turbines, and actually reduce the amount of fossil fuels you are using and dramatically increase the efficiency of your system. Also, in the same way that Moore's law has increased the power of computing, processing speeds and capacities, we've seeing similar kind of declines in the cost of battery storage for these types of renewable energy. And indeed, the electric car is going to be perhaps as important as a form of energy storage as it is a form of sustainable mobility. Many analysts are now saying the electric vehicle should be seen as the coal truck of the 21st century, with the ability to store and move energy around where it needs to be in much the same way as these moustache-wired gentlemen would have done back in the day. Once we've got 1 million electric vehicles on the road, we can connect them into the grid. They act as a collective, collaborative national battery. And this digital connectivity starts to give us what we might call an emergent renewable energy superpower, which can dramatically begin to decarbonize the grid. It's what that same gentleman we mentioned earlier from the Ethernet, Bob Metcalfe, calls the Enernet, where the Enernet begins to do for energy what the internet has done for information. And we're already seeing this happening in small pockets. A UK company called Piclo is starting to provide the operating platforms which allow for this dynamic two-way exchange of energy. This peer-to-peer energy trading is now taking place, where people can swap and exchange energy live and dynamically in real time. And of course, therefore, if you know where the grid is and you are in control of the grid, then you will have a huge role to play in the same sort of platform capitalist type fashion that companies like Uber have managed to exploit, and why China has been quietly buying up grids all over the world, because who owns the grid controls the flow of the energy. But also it means it's great for communities. And people to be able to buy and own and actively participate in a decentralized dynamic exchange of energy rather than a linear industrial pipe. So these metaphors apply whether we're talking about the digital world or indeed now the energy world. And then we've got the sort of fluffier end of things where you've got search engines like Ecosia, who are obviously diverting a huge chunk of their turnover to actually planting trees to offset the impacts of their searching. Sounds like small potatoes, but actually, I just checked the site last night, nearly 150 million trees have now been planted, 36 million euros invested to offset that income. So there are more elegant ways of doing some of our online digital world. And also that's going to require us taking back control of some of our data. As Tim Berners-Lee, obviously one of the founding fathers, or the founding father of the World Wide Web, with his platform Solid, which aims to take back control of some of our personal data and put it back under our own auspices. Because, as he said, the web's evolved into an engine of inequity and division. And it's being used by powerful forces for their own agendas, rather than perhaps that grand vision that he perceived in the beginning. I want to conclude on an idea around heart-led technology, because as the ancient Greek philosopher Thales said, we live not in reality on the summit of a solid earth, but at the bottom of an ocean of air. And in a similar way, right now, I think in our digital world, we are not yet reaching the aspiration of that virtual heaven that we might have dreamt. But we are actually languishing slightly more at the bottom of a rather torrid swamp. But I went on an incredible experience at the Saatchi Gallery in London a couple of years ago called We Live at the Bottom of an Ocean of Air, put on by a group called Marshmallow Laser Feast. And it was a virtual reality experience which took you in to the world of a giant sequoia. And once you put on the headset, you could see the blood vessels flowing through the veins in your hands. You could visualize your own breath, and you could see the dynamic exchange that was going on between you and this giant sequoia tree, the inextricable interdependence of our own chemistry and biology and its links with the rest of the natural world was made vividly real. And it was quite breathtakingly beautiful to be able to see the intangible made tangible using the technology in this fashion. People were moved to tears by the particular experience. And for those of us with the scientific background, it was an incredibly powerful way of seeing those things that we knew to be happening, but made very, very visual in front of us. And Marshmallow Laser Feast call this XR, not in terms of the Extinction Rebellion sense, but extended reality. How do we use technology to better connect us to the natural world? To not have this false division between the digital and the ethereal world and the kind of physical natural world, but to actually bring those two closer together and to use technology to really emotionally move us and reconnect us with the wild. And as my friend Tom Mansfield says, this is what we might call heart-led technology, which is technology in service of something deeper than just the wants and mores of the mind and those endless dopamine satisfaction loops that online shopping and gaming and these other synthesized gratifications tend to provide. And I think it's a big question of what would a heart-led digital and technological world begin to look like if we were to use that different lens. But I think the point I want to leave you with is the fact that this is all quite knife edge stuff. As a sci-fi writer, William Gibson famously observed, the future's out there, it's just not evenly distributed yet. Because we can see, like the example I just shared around heart-led technology, but also the renewable energy revolution and the shifts in the way that we perhaps might acquire and store and use our data, there's room for positivity and optimism, but equally the collapse is out there. It's just not evenly distributed yet, which gives you this sense of knife edge context. Because ultimately, I think after I say a very long time working in this space, the planet doesn't need to be saved or rescued or even changed. And I think these mantras around saving the planet are a little bit distracting, because what the planet really needs is to be loved. and to be valued and to be appreciated and to have gratitude for the wondrous gifts and bounty that have been ours to steward. And I think that's a far more powerful, transformative motivator than the saving of the planet. And I think this will pan out for businesses and organizations as a sort of shakedown, that there are only two types of company now, the brave and the dead. There are those that can see the regenerative future that builds back our natural systems, restores our habitats and our wildlife and our ecosystem services, and is a technology perhaps led by the heart that aligns with the future of all life. And there are those technologies which are dead, which are resisting the change, which are willfully blind to their impacts and are not delivering the transformation required. And if I wanted to be provocative in conclusion, in the same way that those big energy giants knew about climate change and the impacts that they were wreaking through their provision of services to the world in the form of fossil fuel energy, they've known, and we are likely to see many more legal cases exposing the facts that they've done all of this in full knowledge. In many ways, the big tech giants also know the damage that is being wrought through the platform capitalism, through the fragmentation and undermining of democracy, through the angry clouds that gather where we gather online. And I think Darth Vader would find this a wry example, because if we look at the way that we continue to accelerate our digital world, we have to be cautious, because it could be a bit like him describing the construction of a new Death Star as an amazing job creation opportunity. I've hopefully made clear that technology can be an incredible force for good, but we have to be conscious about the way that we apply it in addressing this climate question. So if I had to translate that more directly, I'd say any investment of time or money that doesn't put human health or the environment at the heart isn't an investment, it's a cost on our collective future. And I think ultimately this won't be about data insights. This won't be about an analysis of evidence, or as I said right at the beginning, the prediction of existing trends. This truth won't actually liberate us until we have the skills and the habits and the talents, but perhaps most importantly, the moral courage to use it. Because if I was to put a number to this, then actually the Stern review done by the UK government in 2006, so 16 years ago now, calculated the annual percentage of global GDP required year on year to tackle climate change at 2%. And to put COVID in context, COVID cost us somewhere between 3 and 4%. It's also, ironically, the annual percentage of global GDP spent on perverse subsidies. So we spend 2% of GDP on subsidizing things like the fossil fuel industry. So we don't need new money. We need to reallocate and move the existing money. It's also the required percentage of GDP on defense spending for NATO membership. So we would never question that 2% on defense spending for NATO membership in the current context of the horrors in Ukraine. And perhaps we need to shift those perverse subsidies, and every organization should be looking to invest 2% of its turnover on addressing its own data and climate impacts. Because really we're in a situation now where insights from our own historical experience are only going to get us so far, and those genuinely brave and courageous organizations are the ones learning from the future. Because right now, only the impossible is interesting. And as we begin to address this nexus that I described right at the start of digital, energy, carbon, and climate, is going to require us to collaborate and challenge one another in ways that we have not been able to do effectively before, but which our collective future potential ultimately entirely depends on. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Ed. It's so thought-provoking to go through that. You know, it's one that I just wrote down. One of the quotes you had there is like, sometimes we're all on multiple sides at the same time. We want all the benefits, but yet we kind of want to see the more positive impacts of our our own personal use of energy. Just for everyone still with us, please get your questions into Ed over the Q&A or over the chat, and I'll be happy to read them out. Charles had an interesting one for you, Ed. He said, thank you for being... He said, but can you highlight the most positive development of thinking? In other words, what has made you smile recently as the progress has been faster than you thought in technology? Thanks for that, Charles.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Charles. I mean, to be honest, I think the biggest thing that makes me smile is the awakening, is the consciousness and the awareness around this challenge, which obviously is the critical factor for unlocking all of the latent potential that we know is out there. And I mentioned it several times in the talk, but as a genuine veteran of this space, it was a very lonely job 20 years ago, and the very fact that it's now so much at the heart of like organizational strategy, growth visions, the very purpose and existence of why we kind of do what we want to do, and I think human ingenuity has the capacity to be deployed in terms of addressing all of these things. I mean, the caveat to that is I'm not a one-dimensional techno utopian. I do believe that some of this stuff has to be a little bit more earthy, but I often talk about it as sort of handicraft and spacecraft. It's doing more things with our hands as well as finding technological answers. So it's that blossoming awareness which can only hopefully lead to greater practical action, which is the thing that always lifts my heart.
Very good. Very good. I was curious. I mean, we see it even now, obviously, with Ukraine. Germany have come under pressure a little bit recently. They're closing down their nuclear plants while they're still importing oil and that over and back. What's the right way to do things? You talk about that kind of cultural war on net zero. Where do you kind of see that kind of ending up? That competing voices around, drilling. A lot of people calling for more nuclear energy because it's deemed to be, less have an impact on the environment in terms of drilling or fracking. How do you see that playing out over those mappings that you saw with nuclear? Because again, the counter argument to nuclear or to renewables and wind is that we get lots of wind on the west of Ireland and we get lots of rain, but it's not always there when you need it, and solar is not always there when you need it. How do you kind of see all that playing out?
Well, I mean, there's a really big thing around timing and also what I would say as economic opportunity cost. So I think part of the issue here and some of the demands that are being made, for either fracking or more oil and gas exploration, or as you say, more nuclear. The issues with those is firstly, they won't be online anytime soon. It takes a decade, in the optimistic sense, to build a new nuclear plant. And also the lock-in that further oil and gas exploration then gives you to fossil fuels ongoing into the future. Because once you start to invest all of that capital into that type of infrastructure, then you effectively create a kind of economic lock-in going forward. It's far smarter to invest that money, which is the opportunity cost, which can only be invested once, in renewables, which can be online much, much faster. And what I was trying to start to describe in my talk is that we have to think about the energy system very differently. If you want to just grow the energy system without demand management and predict a kind of ever escalating level of consumption, then you will come to the conclusion that probably nuclear is the right answer. If you actually look at it, as I was trying to begin to describe, as a much more dynamic connected system where we might all be generators of energy ourselves through some form of small scale renewables, where you're actually able to bring down some of the overall demand and bring in other elements of storage, whether it's batteries or electric vehicles, then actually you look at a solar, wind and battery managed grid in a very, very different way. And that is a different energy system, in the same way that we had a different energy system when we were all burning coal on the fire or turf, or heaven forfend, peat. And it's like those were our traditional energy systems, and our energy system is going to change again. And so sometimes I would say if the answer is nuclear, you're asking the wrong question.
Very interesting. With a question in: does Greenpeace work in collaboration with researchers today on what kind of activist technology? So let me see. So I guess where you're working with researchers today on different types of technologies that we could apply in the future.
Oh yeah, I mean, certainly Greenpeace is, a technology advocate when we can see it making huge progress. I mean, I guess there's possibly two parts to that question as well. I mean, in terms of the technology that activists use, I mean, weirdly, and I'll hold my hands up here, Greenpeace is very dependent on Facebook because as a platform, it's what connects us to our members, and some people, I think, rightly are a little uncomfortable with that. But in terms of, advocating for the right technological innovations, I mean, again, if you go back 20 years, you will have seen Greenpeace being an incredible vocal advocate of the potential for offshore wind, which, certainly in Ireland and the UK, where I live in East Anglia has the highest concentration and density of offshore wind turbines pretty much anywhere in the world. It's an extraordinary transformative success story. And Greenpeace was involved in creating the first sort of community energy-based renewable energy company called Juice with Empower 2 decades ago. So yes, we will always try and put ourselves at the right side of the technological change, which will dramatically reduce those carbon emissions.
Very good, thank you. And I'm going to just, in the interest of time, I'm going to give you one last question. I'll let you go then, conscious of your time. So this is from Neve, which is a nice one to end on, I think. Is there any one piece of advice that you would give to today's teenagers on technology and climate changes they can continue to deal with during this energy crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think for young people, the biggest thing is not, sorry, I get a bit emotional about this, but it's not to give up on hope. I mean, I've got a lot of, activist friends who are young, who are really, really scared and can feel like the sense of burnout and paralysis. And I think it is for those of us who are more seasoned, who have seen, the long arc of history beginning to bend in the right direction, not quick enough, not at scale enough, but at least directionally correct. So the advice I always give to those campaigners in a youthful sense is, never give up, because as I used to say to my younger colleagues when I was running my agency, is we always overestimate what we can achieve in a year and underestimate what we achieve in a decade. I mean, the clock is ticking, and the road to 2030 with this 50% cut in emissions is going to be a bumpy one, but it is doable, and it will be a transformative thing for us in our hearts as well as it is in our heads.
I think that's the perfect way to leave this. And thank you so much, Ed. I mean, it was so thought-provoking what you brought us through this morning. A great way to kick off the AtlanTec Festival. Again, for everyone, there's another session starting just now. We've got sessions all. We've got AtlanTec.ie. Follow us on Twitter. And Ed, just on behalf of the committee again, thank you so much. I think you can see all the comments coming in here in chat. I think it was just a fantastic session. So thank you so much.
Have a great rest of your event, and thank you for the honor of opening it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks for that, Ed.